morning.
Morning.
Welcome on this Labor Day weekend, as fall should be around the corner. In the lesson this morning, Jesus actually tells 3 stories about suppers. I see implications in each story for our reception of the Lord's Supper this morning. One's a parable of the great feast. Stress the importance of attending when invited. You have a rich man who invites a lot of people to a feast. In those days, those feasts can last a week. There's no expense spared in these feasts. The servers are sent out with invitations to the social event of the year. The excuses were all they brought back to the master. Some excuses were quite lame. If you follow down to verse 23, one of them said he just bought a piece of land, now you need to go out and look at it. How many of you would buy land without looking at it first? If so, I got some land in the swamps for you to buy. That's kind of suspicious. Another man said he just bought 10 new oxen or 5 yoked oxen. Now he wanted to go check them out. That's like buying a car without ever taking it for a drive or kicking the tires. So that's kind of suspicious. Then the third man said he wanted to stay home with his new wife. Well, that's a great idea. But totally out of character for society back then, because at that point in time, sadly enough, women were treated as possessions, and it was their job to please the husband, not the other way around. That very seldom happened that way. So Jesus' listeners must have laughed at hearing all these excuses. But the host of the story wasn't laughing. He got understandably angry. No one likes to be taken for granted. None of us like to be taken for granted. Today, we are invited to a special function. If you fail to attend, you could find yourself receiving a bill in the mail from the host because you failed to show up. You've read newspapers, there are people that have received those type of things. They fail to show for a birthday party, they fail to show for a dinner. They receive a bill to cover their portion of the meals. But you have to remember something. The host in these parable stories represents God. When Jesus first told the parable, the ones receiving the invitations were the Pharisees, and they didn't respond. Today, the ones receiving the invitation are us. We each are invited to God's messianic banquet feast, the Lord's Supper. The thing is, how do you recognize the wonder of that invitation? You accept that invitation with joy. A second parable in the 14th chapter of Luke is a parable of the places at the table. The parable points out the danger of thinking too much of ourselves as we come to the table. And one of the guests at the wedding feast sits down boldly at the best place at the table. And the host comes along and tells the presumptuous guest, take a lower place, somewhere below the salt. It's a humiliating and embarrassing moment for that presumptuous guest. And Jesus' point is this: those who make too much of themselves will be humbled, but those who humble themselves before God and each other will be lifted up. Good manners at the communion table also include not thinking too much of ourselves. As we come to the Lord's table, we're all sinners in need of salvation, beggars needing bread. We are the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind in that third story. Maybe not literally poor, crippled, lame, and blind, but spiritually we're poor, crippled, lame, and blind. Yet God graciously includes us as guests at God's table. Good communion table manners include coming to the table without thinking too much of ourselves. And thirdly, good communion table manners include coming without looking down on other guests at that same table. For all of us are God's equally beloved guests. King George IV desired communion and sent a servant to the Bishop of Winchester, inviting him to come and serve. When that servant arrived with the bishop, he was quite angry. The king felt he took him too long, and so he upbraided the man right there and fired him on the spot. And having done that, he turned to the bishop for communion. But the bishop refused to proceed. He saw that the king was still angry. Realizing the bishop was right, the king called the servant back. He apologized and restored the man's job. It was only then that communion proceeded. Part of good table manners is extending graciousness to the other guests. As we have been forgiven and welcomed by God, let us forgive and welcome each other. The Apostle Paul's advice is to examine ourselves before we receive communion. Have we received God's invitation with joy? Do we recognize ourselves in our neediness? Are we open to other guests? These are good manners at the Lord's table. Amen.